This video will explore RETScreen's portfolio analysis for performance projects. I already have my database of projects here in my portfolio, and when I go to the dashboard worksheet here, under the Performance button, I have the options to create an analysis for my portfolio. Clicking on the first one, this dialog lets us choose what to include in our analysis. It's the main control center for performance analysis projects. There are lots of options here, and we'll continue to add features over time, so we'll spend a bit of time getting familiar with this. On the left-hand side, we tell RETScreen what we want to include in our analysis, and on the right-hand side, we tell RETScreen how we're going to display our data. You'll also see that the various controls are grouped into different sections. These groups will help you understand what the options in that group do. The top group on the left side is called Performance Analysis, and these controls will let us control what data from each of our files we want to use in our RETScreen analysis. Let's quickly go through some of these options. The first one asks us to choose which summary to use in our files. Remember that in each individual RETScreen file, we need to have created a summary of the data we wish to use in the portfolio. This important step is covered in another video. The summary will aggregate the various inputs and will manage the various units, emission factors, dates, and more. In RETScreen, we can perform our analysis on end-use fuel consumption, on electricity production, and even a catch-all user-defined to aggregate anything else like water, waste, recycling, and more. Then we tell RETScreen more information about this data. For example, is our end-use fuel consumption from buildings and facilities, vehicles, or other transportation fleets? And then, do we want to analyze the actual fuel consumption, its costs, or the associated emissions? Next, we get to tell RETScreen if we want to analyze the actual historical consumption or compare it to predicted values. If you've done any baseline modeling in your files, creating regressions and normalizing the data against weather, for example, you can use that here. Next, we get to choose what energy unit we want, and lastly, whether we want to express the consumption intensity or not. Let's leave this as is and just click on OK to see what we get. You'll notice that we get a graph that shows for each year what the total aggregate fuel consumption was for each facility in my portfolio. The units are fuel consumption in kilowatt hours, just like we had in the dialog, and if we hover over any of the bars, we see a breakdown per facility. The graph is always based on the data in the table below, where you'll see one row for each facility and a total at the bottom. If I click on this Details button, I get a window where I can see the full dataset with some tools, including the ability to export to a clipboard. You can edit any graph by clicking on the Format Graph button, and we get the same dialog as before. This next section, called Filter, allows us to select a portion of the data in our analysis and is one of the most powerful tools in our portfolio analysis. This first option lists all of the groups and subgroups in my portfolio so that I can run my analysis on any of them. This is a really powerful feature so that you can include all of your facilities, all of your vehicles and fleets in any way that you want. In a previous video, we covered how to create groups. The next option asks us how we want to aggregate the data. Of course, we group by the name of each facility or building, but we can also group by any of the default columns we have in our facility information, such as the country, region, province, state, the type of facility, or even group by real property versus transportation. And there are even options to group by type of fuel source across our multiple facilities. As an example, let's group our portfolio by fuel type. The next option allows us to add a second grouping. So for example, you could break down the fuel type and then by province or state, or by facility type. Lastly, you can isolate by fuel type and choose how you want to include renewables. Let's click on OK, and our graph changes. This time it's showing us the fuel consumption for each year, but instead of aggregating by facility, it's aggregating by fuel type. You can see that the vast majority of the fuel consumption for this portfolio is from electricity and natural gas. Let's use this to start asking some questions about our portfolio, like, what is the source of emissions for my energy consumption? I can right-click on the label here and duplicate my analysis, and then right-click again to click on Format Graph. This is just a shortcut to the same button in the menu. This time, I'll choose GHG emissions. Now I see where my emissions are coming from. Now maybe I want to see just the emissions from electricity and show that for each building. So again, clicking on Duplicate, then Format Graph. This time I'm going to select Group by Facility Name, but now choose a single fuel, electricity. Clicking on OK, I see which facilities have the highest emissions from electricity. Lastly, we'll open the Format Graph dialog again and take a moment on the options on the right-hand side. Remember, this is how we present the data. Here at the top, we can choose when the year starts, either a calendar or fiscal year. Next, we get to choose how much data gets included in my graph and table. We can look at data for the last 5 years or from a specific date. And here in timescale, we get to tell RetScreen if we want to aggregate the data on a yearly, quarterly, or monthly basis, both in the graph and in the data. At the bottom, we choose between a few different graph types, stacked graphs or simple bar graphs. Clicking on OK again, we see that our graph reflects all of the changes we've put in. One last note, this button beside the Format Graph allows you to create a default settings for all future graphs. For example, suppose your organization uses April 1st as the start of its fiscal year and always wants to look at the last decade of data and use the 2014-15 year as a reference, for example. You can use this to create a preset. You can also apply this preset to all the existing graphs if you want.